Good evening. We're pleased to welcome McLain Clutter as this evening's lecturer. He's the first of this year's Future City Session speakers, convened by the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative with his support from the George Gunn Foundation. The CUDC Future City Sessions are an exploration of emerging ideas in urban design and city making. These sessions invite leading national thinkers to present their work through public presentation or workshop on a specific topic. These emerging issues are also discussed with local leaders in their field to produce and expand institutional knowledge and to foster debate. I welcome you to approach myself or other CUD staff members tonight if you have ideas regarding the next Future City topic. There are also forums in the back of the room, I think by the cheese, discussing ideas about the future of cities. Cheese and future. Tonight's speaker, McLain Clutter, asks important questions about the role of design, architecture, media, image, and power as they pertain to city making. His design practice, Master of None, is dedicated to rethinking architecture's disciplinary capacities within the complexities of contemporary urbanism. McLain is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture. He holds degrees from Syracuse University and the Yale School of Architecture, where he received the Everett Victor Meeks Fellowship. His writing and design work has been featured in such publications as Manu, Pigeon, Rayroom, 306090, the Journal of Architectural Education, the CUDC's Urban Infill issue Diagrammatically, and the volume formerly Urban, Projecting Rust Belt Futures, in which he discusses the city of Cleveland's relationship to its medical and education complex. McLain's new book, Imaginary Apparatus, New York City and its Mediated Representation, was recently released from the University of Chicago Press and Park Books. In it, he explores the role of media depictions in New York City under the tenure of Mayor John Lindsay between 1966 and 1973, as they related to urban design and planning practices. In it, he examines the relationship between official planning documents, cinema, and economic drivers as often symbiotic and complex forces in the city. Please join me in welcoming McLain Clutter.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a nice introduction. And thanks to Terry, who I know is in Japan now, and also to John, CUDC, and Ken. It's been nice to be back in Cleveland. As I told the students in the workshop the other day, I went to high school on the west side, and spent a lot of my summers at what was Van Dyke Place in West Lakeland. So it's nice to be back and to see what's happening, and I'm pretty enthusiastic about what you guys are doing down here. Can everybody hear me in the back? Am I being loud enough? The title of the talk tonight is Master of None, which is borrowed from the title of my design and research practice. And really, as I think Jeff already very nicely pointed out, the work in the practice is really committed to rethinking architecture's efficacy within the kind of multidisciplinary milieu of contemporary urbanism. So I'm interested in kind of taking on the kind of broader range of issues that come with any project for the contemporary city, but I'm also interested in going through that and reasserting those kinds of fundamental disciplinary categories that we as architects have always offered the city, things like form, space, configuration. Just to give you a kind of disposition to the work, I would self-diagnose a kind of almost schizophrenia. I'm always interested in kind of expanding the breadth of issues and concerns that we bring to the table, but I'm also really stubborn about those things that I think that we as architects can actually control about the city. And I think you'll see this kind of motion from within the discipline to outside to back in several of the projects that I'll show you tonight. So I don't really have to talk about this anymore because Jeff already talked about it, but it was going to be a brief commercial for my book, which is about the relationship between media and urban design in New York during the urban crisis. It's available on Amazon, designed by a very, very good Swiss graphic designer. And I'm really excited that I'm not working on it anymore. As anybody who's given birth to a book probably can understand. So back to the lecture. I'm going to begin by presenting a project called Radical Railbanking. And to explain the project, I have to kind of start by reciting one of these exterdisciplinary terms that I told you characterizes my work in general. So this is the first of two projects that I'm going to discuss tonight that are kind of probing the relationship between big data and contemporary urban development. And you guys will have to bear with me. There's a bit of background. A lot of my projects have a little bit of background information that I have to move through in order to make the project legible to you. So the specific kind of data that I'm interested in this project is a kind of data called geodemography. Since this isn't really an everyday word in architectural discourse, I have provided my definition here. And I've defined geodemography as the study of the geographic distribution of demographic data, especially as this data is used for marketing research. So there's now a kind of growing demand for geodemographic data that's created in the industry, populated by corporations like Axiom and Claritas. And these corporations sell designer data sets for commercial use. And among the many products that they sell are kind of baroque data assemblages called market segmentation sets. And this is one. This is produced by Esri, which is also the largest producer of GIS technology in the world. And so market segmentation sets are these kinds of complex aggregations of census data, consumer spending information, figures that get scraped from internet usage, and kind of other sources through which we as consumers every day surrender data about ourselves, often kind of mindlessly. So market segmentation sets then combine and synthesize data that make often contentious assumptions about race, ethnicity, sexuality, consumer tastes, and lots of other characteristics, synthesizing these to create kind of idiosyncratic and highly manufactured consumer identities, and then linking those identities to their locales in our cities and urbanized areas. So what are these used for? These kind of data sets will help corporations know where to distribute direct mailing campaigns. That's one of the oldest uses for them. Or critically and increasingly, this kind of data will help kind of something like a big box outlet know where to put their store to attract the right consumer set. This is kind of a growing use of geodemography in real estate analytics. So in this way then, market segmentation sets kind of redescribe or think about the spatiality of urbanized areas as a kind of assemblage of spatio-statistical consumer territories. They basically describe the built environment as a function of the ability of commercial programs to capture design consumer groups. Now, if you skim through some information science literature about geodemography, you'll find a kind of wave of skepticism from scientists. Some just kind of challenge the assumption that one's identity necessarily correlates with where he or she lives, while others will just simply say that this is garbage data, that this is kind of garbage in, garbage out. On the flip side, if you skim through some kind of white papers of literature from the geodemography industry, you'll find a wealth of success stories, companies, talking about how this has kind of helped their bottom line in all of these ways and helped them to grow and expand and to create new territory. So that debate is largely unresolved. But there's a third way of looking at it that perhaps makes this kind of difference of opinion moot. And that is that it's possible that whether or not market segmentation can accurately describe existing consumer groups, somehow its instrumentalization makes its assumptions true. And speaking aptly to this effect, the geographer John Goss has written, "My concern over this technology is not whether geodemographics really can accurately predict profitable marketing strategies, but rather that geodemographics displays a strategic intent to control social life, and that the ideological conception of identity and social space within the model may become real. In other words, that the assumptions will be validated as the strategy takes effect." So again, to unpack the Goss quote, while the integrity of these kinds of products are questionable, in a sense, their instrumentalization makes them true. So to bring that into our discipline, development guided by market segmentation sets serves to reify or make real these kinds of latent consumer groups identified. And just to reiterate the point, significantly, Goss indicates that the underlying assumptions within these data are often contentious. They make contentious idea or assumptions about subjectivity, about race, ethnicity, ideological assumptions. And so the instrumentalization of this data reinforces these kind of constructed and contentious sociocultural divides. So why should we care? Architecture, what we do, plays a critical role in the way geodemography is instrumentalized. More often than not, development guided by geodemography limits design, limits what we get to do, by recommending the repetition of kind of conventional commercial building types. But again, these resultant buildings can be understood to exercise tremendous agency. When commercial real estate developers use geodemography to choose a site for development, their buildings then deeply implicate these kinds of constructed consumer groups that are described within space. They become kind of beacons or attractors for this kind of recombination of consumers. So to break it down in a different way, again, I think we tend to believe that the distribution of consumer programs in urbanized space is tuned to the existing consumer demand. But it may be that this kind of consumer landscape manufactures actually new and hybrid consumer groups through the control of urban space. So, despite this critique, despite all of that I get from the kind of Marxist geographers, as an architect, I think that we also might find reason in our disciplinary history for some excitement about this effect of geodemography. And this is because the ability, perhaps, of development guided by geodemography to kind of make real these kind of hybrid and constructed consumer groups bears kind of haunting reminiscence or a kind of haunting similarity to this kind of idea of the social condenser within the history of our discipline, or the ability of an architecture to kind of make a new public or re-aggregate, put back together a kind of different cross-section of what the public might be. And this is a kind of disciplinary legacy that we could trace at least from the constructivists up to very recent kind of theoretical posturing about architectures that make new publics or make new audiences. So that's cynical, but with risk of cynically equating the public with the consumer group, the project that I'm going to show you is interested in thinking about how geodemography might be leveraged to suggest environments that might condense then new definitions of the urban public. So on to the project then. Railbanking. Railbanking, many of you probably know what this is, but it's a process through which unused railways and easements can be developed as public space. So railways are often assembled from land parcels that have a varied ownership types. Some are owned outright by the rail company, others are granted the rail company on kind of limited rights of use, others are owned by yet another third party. And when one wants to turn a rail or an abandoned rail into a trail, there's a huge insurance problem essentially based on all of those different ownership types. And so railbanking was created to kind of consolidate the ownership of these lands along the rail so that it can create a single kind of unified terrain for public realm. So this project then borrows and amplifies this idea of railbanking. The project targets the territories that line the major railways throughout Detroit, shown here in pink. And I'm interested in these kind of territories for a couple of reasons. For one, even within the kind of evacuated context of Detroit, these areas lining the rails are sometimes surprisingly vast and empty. And this is because the rails are often lined with these old industrial parcels where factories once were that are now gone. So I think that the kind of scale of these parcels demand to be kind of more radically reimagined. A couple more images of the rail going through Detroit. And then the second reason I'm really interested in these areas is because they currently and historically have negotiated abrupt formal and demographic division within the city, as these diagrams begin to indicate. So I think we can think about the rails and the kind of large industrial parcels that line them as a kind of divider that has heightened and built up both the spatial and demographic difference between its sides over time. So just as conventional rail banking consolidates land and yield public space, this project I'm going to show analyzes and recombines potentials that are latent in this kind of heightened spatial and statistical relationship between the land parcels along Detroit's rails. And this is important. The project is always kind of imaging compound relationships. So that's important to me because while most applications of geodemography are fundamentally positivist and kind of limited by the categories of data collection, my project is always trying to reformulate data, always trying to kind of recut it and find new relationships within it. And key to this process is a technique called tin modeling. And this is not really that technologically sophisticated. This is a modeling technique that was developed in order to interpolate topography and its associated attributes like slope and aspect. But my project then uses tin modeling to eschew and make relational and remix the categories and identity assumptions of conventional geomorphology. So to go through the project, I have to kind of make it a little bit legible. I have to go through it kind of step by step. So first, with this slide, the lines of the kind of selected rails through the city are offset 1 mile, kind of loosely approximate a walking distance or walking corridor. And then one of these tin models, an initial tin model, is created by interpolating population density values as they register on those offset lines across the corridor that the offset creates. So this interpolation then creates a model that shows change or volatility in kind of overall population density as it crosses the offset corridor. And in this model, and all of those that follow, if you see the two kind of offset lines from the rail, I end up only being interested in the information that is between those two lines. And so I was telling the students, when I did this project, GIS could not easily delete the rest of the model. Now it can. So here's that same model, then just turned down in axonometric. And then next, I analyzed the model and the ridges above that kind of railway offset corridor with the highest values are isolated. So I think of these ridges as, or these ridges do, they represent relatively high population density values where they intersect with either one or both of these railway offset lines. In either case, they represent places where the tin model is touching down and there are either, there's unusual vitality on one side or another, so they represent a kind of vector, potential vector of urban development that might connect or channel unusually populous neighborhoods. And then lines at the locations of these things are projected back down onto the city and combined with the railway to create what I was calling the kind of connective armature diagram across the railway's proximity. And then this thing gets used as a kind of geometric basis for a second round of tin models that are based on demographic data. And data sets for these tins are then chosen because they relate to a couple of different categories. Either they relate to conventional demographic categories that seek to define a community, like the African American community or the Hispanic community, or because they relate to programmatic elements that have been historically conceptualized as kind of structural programs within urbanism. So I use something called religion index because to me it begins to speak of churches, cathedrals, things that have been structural, or the education index because they speak of schools, or the kind of blue-collar population because they speak of factories. So data that might get me to some sort of programs that have been historically conceptualized as structural. And I'll just kind of go through these models. These are the community models, African American population, the youth population, the Caucasian population, the Hispanic population, and then the ones I'm calling city builders, mass transit use, highly educated population, religion index, and the blue-collar population. So for me, this step images relationships between data as they register on that connective armature and projects those relationships across the space between. So the models are no longer meant to be kind of statements of statistical fact. They're meant to image compound relationships that are both spatial and statistical, kind of spatial means of recutting the data. And then the two models are analyzed to isolate only the faces of the model where the most intense slope values exist. So these kinds of high slope faces I interpret as regions within the relationships modeled where the values are just the most volatile, or where the most potential for change exists, just like slope indicated in physical physics. So these high slope regions then are projected back onto the city, and they create what I think of as or the basis of what I think of as a kind of new type of zoning map. So again, the intention in all of these slightly scientific steps is to hybridize and make relational the data that I've used. So as I said again, I only end up being interested in the parts of the model between those initial offsets. And here, which you can mostly see, but it's more vivid on the screen. This is the geometry of those slopes layered as they then intersect with that kind of offset corridor. Brought into Illustrator with a different kind of transparency so I can see the patterns essentially that this data makes on one another. And this is just a legend for the patterns you just saw, so again, they're related to the categories of tins I showed you. And then added to the map is a few things, a field of very low value land banked or city-owned properties, which are these things on your left. I think of these things as parcels that are immediately available for use for any kind of future redevelopment strategy. And then also added are things like schools, parks, and major roads, which are thought of as existing entities that might inform decision-making in any kind of future strategy. So here's an overall map with those entities added. And here's another detail. And here then all of those available land parcels are shown in white as they cross over the railway across that corridor. So then what I end up with is a kind of layering of these high slope regions, which for me indicate areas of potential change or volatility or mixing of the relationships of the image, and a field of parcels that intersect this corridor that are ready to host elements of some kind of development strategy that might be suggested by this overlaying of slopes. So then using the map to develop strategies for urban development requires really kind of a process of pattern recognition, a process of deciphering, designing, and making up rules for operation within the relationships that the map makes visible. So for me, that means that the map becomes a kind of medium for the projection of architectural and urban speculation, or really a medium of design, not so much science and more design, but one that importantly is yielded through kind of gaming with the techniques of conventional geodemography. So one factor here then is using the map to think programmatically, and this is kind of my guide for that. When high slope regions from the blue-collar population tin occupy these available parcels, they become what I call production territories, which might host things like new factories or company towns and so on. High slopes from the religion index tin creates what I call religious territories, which might host things like churches, centers of worship, or maybe pilgrimage trails or distributed nunneries and more. There were several slopes intersect that might host kind of major civic structures, again, getting back to the idea of the social condenser. And I kind of try to select programs that I think will cut across typical demographic division, kind of what I think of as lowest common denominator programs, like mega churches or sports complexes. And so here's the kind of final map with the process of designing and decoding the pattern in process. And then quickly I'll show you just a couple of details of the map. And so I've used the map to project a series of kind of urban scenarios for different sites in Detroit. And I'd like to play, depending on time, probably just two videos that kind of narrate a few of these scenarios. And these things aren't meant to be kind of thorough designs, but again, kind of like scenarios of how one might augur in a way.
Connor Creek is located in northwest Detroit. The neighborhood is most remembered for 20th century mortar factories along the railway, built on top of a creek that once crossed the area. The water table in Connor Creek remains very high as the creek continues to flow underground. When the factories closed, they left behind a cluster of land parcels scaled for industrial development, lining the railway and dividing the neighborhoods to either side. With the introduction of the highway system, and over time, these large land parcels became home to a cluster of campuses or enclaves such as the Wayne County Community College and a mental health hospital. Each programmatic enclave is unusually vital, but each operates insularly in mutual exclusion from its surroundings. In this area, the radical Railbanking zoning map recommends the introduction of religious territories, production territories, civic infrastructure, and a transit center. The available land includes a large, formerly industrial parcel immediately adjacent to the rail and an array of surrounding vacant residential lots. Given the unusual context of vital enclave development, with lifeless urban fabric between, this scheme aspires to implement a commons within which the constituents of the enclaves may mix with those attendant to newly recommended programs. The large formerly industrial parcel is divided into a densely packed clustering of circular lots, straddling and usurping the railway. Critical connections are established out to the surrounding campuses, and a selection of parcels are chosen for larger programmatic catalysts, such as union halls and religious facilities. This arrangement is thought of as an urban medium within which new programs may be inserted, the existing enclaves may expand, and the constituents of each may intermingle. The circular organization is meant to encourage indirect meandering between structures, and some cells are excavated and allowed to flood with water from the subterranean creek. These ponds then solicit uncanny interaction, baptisms, bathing, machinery cooling, and more. Chaldean Town is near the northern border of Detroit. This area is the point of arrival for Chaldean Christians from the Middle East, an ethnic division of Catholicism highly steeped in ceremony. The Chaldeans have historically maintained a tightly knit community, working in small businesses meant to serve the local constituents. The urban fabric reflects this, as the region is primarily residential in scale, with small retail and community facilities lining the arterial roads. As in most of Detroit, this urban fabric has experienced decades of deterioration, leaving porous fields of residential fabric dotted with the occasional commercial establishment or community facility. In this area, the radical Railbanking zoning map recommends the introduction of educational territories, religious territories, production territories, and civic infrastructure. As noted, most of the parcels are available for redevelopment are residential in scale. Hence, this scenario imagines creating a discrete network of educational, religious, productive, and civic entities, each reusing and connecting diffuse residential vacancies. The educational network connects a series of small schoolhouses. The religious network connects a series of house-sized chapels and shrines. The productive network imagines a factory distributed throughout the area's houses, and so on. In each network, the residential vacancies are linked through circular space aggregated from alleys or unused side yards. Inspired by the Chaldean propensity for ritual, movement along each network is conceived as a kind of a ceremonial procession, affording the community a routine spectacle around which the public may consolidate.
Following the work on the Railbanking project, I started to think about a kind of another approach of taking on this relationship between data and urbanism. And what was really bothering me, I guess, about the Railbanking project was that it seemed to assume that data was static, that I could kind of image and recut the data, and then design in a way that was responding to that kind of data image. So in this project, which I call domestic data occupations, I began wondering whether it was possible to kind of reverse that prior process and to instead design for the urban environment in a way that might anticipate or control a place's eventual representation in data or its kind of data image. So in other words, I showed these slides before, I was thinking about whether it was possible to design urban conditions that might produce data that would subvert or affect the conventional characterization of a place in this kind of market segmentation geodemography. Right. So Detroit, again, provided an ideal context for the research. Well, the grant had to be about Detroit, so it was an ideal context for the research. But then we found that it was ideal. We all know, I mean, the kind of financial and physical decay of the city is well known. And this might be obvious, but the condition is confirmed in the kind of geodemographic data documenting the city and its residents. And that's because today, still today, most identity-based geodemographic data is collected at the scale of the household unit through the monitoring of package deliveries, or internet use, television viewing, and all of these other kinds of activities that we do at home. So reflecting on this, it becomes clear that one of Detroit's most obvious physical problems, this massive number of domestic vacancies that you've probably seen a map of a million times, also amounts to a kind of image problem in data for the city. So while Detroit's vacancies are a kind of network of physical and spatial voids, they are also a massive network of data voids. And this kind of depravity of consumer data produced by Detroit's neighborhoods then reiterates its physical conditions. So by extension, a conventional application of geodemography would recommend either little in the way of new development or development that just confirmed the kind of conditions in the city's neighborhoods. So it's partially obvious, but it also constitutes a kind of vicious circle between the Detroit's plight and one metric that might be used to drive development that might start to erode that plight. So this project then tried to kind of take on that vicious circle. Again, a very theoretical project, but the idea was to project kind of transgressive design occupations of these domestic vacancies that will begin to produce data that will eschew the characterization of these locations. So a few kind of core questions were driving what we were doing. We were interested in kind of finding out or diagnosing how Detroit's built environment and the characterization of the city's neighborhoods in commercial market demography were mutually reinforcing. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. The research here really kind of validated our assumptions. Combined with this kind of depravity of data produced by Detroit's urban vacancies, we found that the consumer landscape of the city was highly tailored to reinforce or kind of be mutually reinforcing with the characterization of these places in commercial market segmentation. And we documented this in a map. This is a portion of the map where the kind of big call-outs are certain market segmentation definitions that we got from a commercial set. And then it's color-coded to those elements of the kind of consumer scape that we thought were reinforcing this kind of stereotype of these people within market segmentation. And there were huge mappings basically over a lot of the city. The upshot is we used these to choose sites eventually, places where there was a relationship we could understand between the consumer scape and the kind of definition of that place in market segmentation. And then second were really a set of questions. If we're going to program these domestic vacancies such that they produce data that somehow screws with their kind of image in market segmentation, then we need to know what kind of activities really feed these things beyond me just telling you that it's your internet usage and your cell phone and everything. So we really tried to find out how are people surrendering data that gets fed into market segmentation? What are the activities that might lead to this? And what kind of corporate and governmental actors are involved? And the answer to the questions turned out to be even more complex than we ever thought. We found a kind of labyrinthine web of these corporate and governmental actors, none of whom seemed to know everything that they were doing, and complex data sharing and aggregating agreements between many of these actors. And we formatted these findings in a huge mapping of what we called the apparatus of geodemography, or contemporary geodemography, along with a video that kind of narrates scenarios of connections between the many actors. And so I'm going to show a kind of quick clip of the video, which again was meant to help us understand what kinds of activities we might scrape out of this to program parts of Detroit.
The contemporary geodemographic data apparatus consists of a diverse network of government agencies, advertising platforms, research firms, and service providers. Operating within the industries of advertising, technology, finance, and real estate, data collection comprises not only an analytical tool for performance evaluation, but a product to be exchanged and sold in large quantities. The strategic alliances of such an apparatus are not always immediately obvious, nor are the means of data mining overt. Instead, throughout one's daily routine, seemingly benign personal information is being covertly profiled, aggregated, sorted, and leveraged for consumer targeting. The advancement of mobile technologies, computing servers, and social media has made such data more personal and more potent, a trend that is likely to intensify. As it does, the effects of geodemography on the social and physical character of the built environment will become increasingly pervasive. Little did you know your mobile phone is a homing beacon. Each time a call or text message is placed from a mobile device, it registers metadata that is collected by service providers like AT&T and Verizon. This data includes the phone numbers of both the sender and recipient, the time, date, and duration of the call, the cell phone towers used, the provider's carrier codes, and the device ID including brand, model, and operating platform. Mobile providers and some smartphone apps like Google Maps also track users in real time via the device's global positioning system. Mobile phone providers sell anonymized location data to research companies like AirSage, who in turn share it with logistic technology companies like Navtech. Navtech provides real-time traffic mapping for mobile apps and delivery services like UPS and FedEx to establish efficient delivery routes. AirSage also sells their data to FAIR and peers for long-term traffic reports to help municipal governments and real estate developers assess infrastructure needs and retail opportunities. Based on traffic counts, developers optimize location selection for new retail outlets that are reliant on highly traveled roadways, like fast food restaurants, hardware stores, and big box retailers.
It gets to that point after kind of each episode of this video, starting with kind of data points, going between different types of actors, which are color-coded. Like the darkest of any color really identifies as a certain kind of actor, and as things fade, it's not so clear exactly how they might self-identify their practice. But the idea is that at the end of each kind of episode that the video goes through, it ends with real estate development, so we understand more tangibly how this begins to then impact the built environment. And I'll go to the end just so we're all nice and paranoid. Following that then, essentially what we did is from the first kind of mapping, we chose a series of sites, and then from this mapping, we started to scrape out some potential programs, and we chose 3 sites within Detroit where we might project these kinds of design occupations of domestic vacancies that might start to produce data. And maybe I'll show one of these, which is also formatted as a video.
Prairie Street and Santa Rosa Drive, between McNichols Road and Puritan Street, is located in northwest Detroit. Conventional geodemographic market segmentation characterizes this neighborhood as one predominantly populated by relatively young, low to middle income, ethnically diverse families of 3 to 4 members. Often composed of first or second generation immigrants, the workers in these families are engaged in the white collar or service industries. These people own their own homes. They shop at BJ's Wholesale Club, watch professional basketball and Spanish language television, read People in Espanol, and drive Japanese automobiles. Relative to many areas in Detroit, this site appears substantially intact. The streets are lined with single-family residences in good repair. However, close examination reveals an array of vacant houses and parcels that comprise the site of this occupation. In order to subvert the characterization of this neighborhood in conventional market segmentation as one that is populated by young immigrant homesteader families with highly routinized and prescribed consumer behavior, this occupation inserts a swell of itinerant aged individuals around whom intense and unexpected consumerism may flourish. This area is imagined as a cooperative retirement community in the form of a network trailer park. The cooperative is composed of 4 nodes, one for residents, one for healing, one for civic and religious functions, and the 4th for recreation. The nodes are then connected through a path cutting through back alleys and side yards. Here, the occupation attempts to blend into its relatively intact surroundings. In each node of the occupation, where completely vacant land parcels are appropriated, residential facades are erected to address the street. Meanwhile, the backyards of these parcels and those adjoining lots hosting vacant houses combine to comprise the occupation grounds. Each node is then designed as a rich spatial interplay of temporary trailers and a gradient of semi-public and private spaces defined between. These nodes are centered on the back alley, which is primary transportation spine for the occupation. The vacant residences around the site are hacked into for the use of the utilities, and critically, they become the addresses through which data about the activities on the site are recorded.
So there were two others of those, which I will not show tonight. That's the one you just saw. There was another that speculated on a kind of occupation without actual human beings there, where kind of just technologies might be deployed. And another one that was a kind of commune for scrappers at the city. And the whole thing was, its native format is as an exhibition, so that you imagine not watching the whole video, but having all of these things kind of running at the same time. And my favorite part of it was that we figured out, and this was just to make people, just to kind of raise the fever pitch of paranoia in the room, we found out that there's a film on televisions that basically make the UV visible, make the rays visible, and we can scrape that film off. And if you scrape the film off and then put it on glasses, what you get is a bunch of glowing rectangles until you put on the glasses. So it's like rotty paper. If anybody remembers that. Okay, something very different. enough with the data project. So this was a project called Empty Pavilion. And one way to talk about this project would be to talk about it in kind of relation to the aesthetics of decay that are kind of so familiar now within Detroit. The idea of this project was to kind of co-opt, see if we might co-opt and then redirect these kinds of aesthetics of decay, moving it away from a kind of narrative of the decline of the city and perhaps one towards a kind of narrative of engagement or urban revitalization. And the project attempts to do this through kind of building on a rich disciplinary legacy of architects implementing techniques of figuration or iconicity or imageability in their designs in a way that is meant to either make sense of the surrounding city or solicit occupancy or frame a certain understanding of common experience. So the project in a way is trying to test the resilience of these kinds of disciplinary ideas or this disciplinary legacy within the very extreme conditions of Detroit. So we designed the pavilion as a kind of collection of architectural figures that are drawn in space. So what do I mean by that? Well, here we see this kind of line tracery through space in this axon, where all of these things I'm calling figures are collected. And here these individual figures have been blown apart, so you can see kind of the definition of each, which is a kind of character or icon or logo. And each is derived from a kind of single line tracery of an underlying lattice of closely packed platonic solids. So here, I think it's still visible for you guys there, the blue underneath is the kind of closely packed geometry, and the black is the kind of tracery of that geometry, or the selective tracery of that geometry through space. And we take those lines, and I describe it as we kind of relax them. We relax the kind of tracery to loosely then approximate this kind of rigorous geometry underlying the line's inception. And the kind of relaxation of this lines, I think, yields a couple of important effects for the project. It affords a kind of fleeting legibility of the kind of intricate geometry, as well as, I think, creating a kind of mood of entropy that resonates in a way with the surrounding city. So the way we talked about it was these lines kind of allow the project to ride the line between an architectural legibility or one that's meant to be read, and an architecture of atmosphere, or one that's meant to be kind of felt. So then from a distance, the project was meant to kind of engage the viewer, the onlooker, in a kind of game of visual, or a kind of visual game of fleeting figuration. So from certain vantage points, the geometry is meant to align, and kind of only momentarily, we're meant to be able to see or recall familiar architectural elements that might kind of entice memory. So in this image, for example, you might recognize the piece of a kind of figural stair or a kind of familiar roof line. Where again, the stair. Or here we might recognize the kind of tracery of a chimney that rhymes with the language of the surrounding residential fabric that we can view straight through the project. Well, from other vantages, the project is meant to kind of present clear and yet unfamiliar figures that are meant to solicit kind of future association, projective association. So in this image where this kind of thing, if you can follow the line all the way around in the corner, creates a figure that we call the Y, which was designed to be both legible and yet not connected to any kind of a specific referent, not meant to look like something you know, so that it might kind of solicit meaning as the project gets used. And so we designed this project as a kind of, another way of thinking about it is a kind of three-dimensional calligraphy in space. We developed these kinds of 3D letter forms through the tracery of that underlying geometry. Here's a page from a kind of pattern book that we created of these kind of calligraphic figures for the project. And then as in calligraphy, the lines were meant to flare, get thicker and thinner to create kind of dynamic figural readings along the lengths of the pieces that come together. And And then meanwhile, the kind of blackness of the lines was important to us. It was meant to kind of collapse the depth of the pavilion into a series of two-dimensional readings, depending on where you are as you move around it. So the idea here, again, is that as one moves around the thing through the depth of the project, it might start to draw kind of 2D figures that might pop out, which again has to do with the kind of rigor and the underlying geometry of the project. There is this geometry that goes all the way through that allows things to sometimes align and sometimes not. And then up close, the pavilion was meant to encourage physical interaction. So there were elements of the design that suggest different kinds of modes of occupation, such as seating or lounging or reclining. And these diagrams are basically meant to show the way the different figures within the project were scaled to ergonomic relationships to the body that would start to solicit occupation. And that was also helped by the fact that it was really weird. It was soft. So it looks hard, but it was actually soft to the touch and warm. So if you were to touch it, it almost feels like, parts of it almost felt like a sofa. Seating, climbing. And the relationship between the pavilion and its site was important to us. It was meant to kind of lend a little bit of definition to this kind of otherwise unvariegated emptiness that was surrounding the site, and kind of also, at the same time, recall aspects of the site's history. So it was in an empty field across from, this is Michigan Central Station, the most iconic piece of ruined porn in all of Detroit. Our project occupies this spot exactly right there, which was once within these blocks of residential fabric, and the project itself is approximately the same volume as that initial house. So there's something about the large logic of the parceling of even the city block that gets loosely recalled by this kind of piece, like a bookend at the corner of the vacant block. And then the design of the ground plan was meant to, again, kind of recall the absent house. So it's the shape of the shadow of the house at one point during the year is drawn in this kind of gravel profile around the pavilion, while the shape of the profile of the shadow of the pavilion at a different time of year is drawn in the white paint that got put on the outside of the gravel. And then from within, the pavilion was meant to frame views out to historically important civic buildings. So traversing this kind of channel we dug in one direction, it looks out to Michigan Central Station. The other direction looked out to John Portman's GM headquarters, the Renaissance Center in Detroit. So there was a kind of tactical co-opting and reappropriation of the kind of iconography of the city that was mediated through the structure itself. And our idea basically was that the project would stay in place for a year. In fact, it lasted a little over 2 years, and it was a research project. It was funded as research. And so we were interested actually in documenting its successes and failures and kind of instigating some sort of public life within its periphery. And at times it did become a kind of venue, hosting kind of unsolicited parties. At other times, it was, I think its efficacy was only aesthetic, not merely aesthetic, but only aesthetic, in that it really punctuated the kind of emptiness of the city in ways that were kind of haunting. And as time went on, we were really interested in the kind of the process of letting the project basically go feral within the landscape. So kind of both blending into the surroundings and then, again, perhaps suggesting that the feral, that the blight, was something that could be aesthetically appropriate and curated through design. And just to quickly explain the process, how we made it, it was made out of over 200 hand-bent carbon steel pieces that were then welded and sheathed with CNC milled nautical foam and then covered with liquid rubber. So it's very funny because, I don't know if you guys think this of Michigan, but most people think that Michigan is like, we have the machines. We bent all of these pieces by hand. And welded them. And kind of put them together in the factory that I work in. I like this video because it also shows the way the thing moved. It was like an old antenna in a way. It would kind of shake but never fall. And I like that to show the kind of alignment and misalignment as you move around. So my dad said, so you made monkey bars. Kind of true. So the next project, it's called Incentive Network, and this was a project I did for it's one of the winning entries for the Dallas Connected City Design Competition in 2014, which was organized by the City of Dallas in collaboration with a handful of local foundations. And it was asking for ideas essentially about how to connect downtown Dallas to the Trinity River. Here's an aerial of Dallas. Here is downtown, kind of to the right. And this muddy creek is what they are calling the Trinity River. And then indicated here is basically the competition site, which is currently populated by things like gentlemen's clubs and liquor stores and similar kinds of programs. And while the river itself is really a muddy creek right now, there is an effort called the Trinity River Corridor Project, which would create a series of kind of connected lakes and wetlands, ostensibly managing flooding in the area. I think probably more importantly to the Chamber of Commerce is it would make Dallas a waterfront city. So suddenly Dallas would have kind of newly saleable waterfront real estate. And the only problem is that the future waterfront then is severed from downtown by this kind of thick band of highway and rail infrastructure. But even given that, the competition basically implored entrants not to think about disturbing the highways, which they explained were kind of a major economic advantage for the city. So it was very funny. There was not to be any of this kind of East Coast area the highway stuff down in Texas. So with that then, the stage was basically set for proposals that would keep the highways while affording another kind of economic advantage for the city over some of its regional competitors, a waterfront, along with the kind of attendant attractions and residential and mixed-use development, probably for the wealthy and upper middle class. So our project was somehow interested in hacking this course of kind of typical neoliberal urbanism through these kinds of design interventions. So we began by first kind of extending the downtown urban grid across all of the property in the competition area that was underdeveloped or completely undeveloped, based on PUDs that were being considered for the site. Then we kind of painstakingly identified all the sections of that highway and rail where the infrastructure was resting on the ground. So basically everywhere where the railway was not elevated. And this was an important analysis for the project because what we went on to propose were the creation of development parcels that bridge the infrastructure resting on the ground. So of course this would have required the cooperation of state and federal governments, but the idea was that developers would be granted the rights to build on these sites in return for kind of radically inflated FARs. And for those radically inflated FARs, they would be required to create public right-of-way across the highways, across the infrastructure, as well as a certain stipulated area of social or civic amenities within the project. So it was really a kind of recitation of a kind of incentive zoning. So next, these new sites were then networked within a kind of bike and pedestrian system that really kind of picked up mostly kind of unusable or previously unusable land, like the easements around highways and railways. And then finally, the remaining blocks were left for development over time. And also, I think in this diagram, you're seeing the kind of an extension of the light rail that was proposed already for the highway. So another way of kind of stitching the waterfront, the new waterfront back to the city. And here's an isometric then of the results with these kinds of large blue buildings, bridging the infrastructure networked along this kind of bike and pedestrian access system. And then zooming in here, each building was kind of labeled with this inflated FAR, as well as a kind of provisional take on a mix of public programs, and then a sufficient amount of commercial and residential development to essentially make the project profitable. So these were all super provisional for the competition entry. And here, it's a study of what it might. I don't like these renderings. These were very quick for the competition, but they're the only things I have to show. For example, what it would be like to cross the highway into a platform at the base of one of the towers. Here in the water, where I think this idea of urban space being defined by the dialogue between these new buildings is pretty clear. So here then, it's basically where the process of speculating through the market, for me, afforded what I thought was a really kind of compelling architectural opportunity, because where the project ended for the competition entry was with a kind of urban environment that's defined by a handful of formative buildings that condense and organize the surrounding city while providing kind of monumental loci for public activity and collective association. So that's where we were when we submitted the competition entry. And then after we found out that we won, I was told that there would be public presentations of the four winning schemes in the months that followed, so I decided to push it a little bit further for those presentations. And I was really interested particularly in exploring the nature of this urban environment that's defined by these formative urban pieces. So I selected one building to kind of push it a little further, and first shaped the building into volumes that could just simply more reasonably house the programs that we suggested. In this case, including condos, a hotel, a mix of civic and commercial space, the elevated platform, as well as public access and parking. And then, so through this process, I started to think carefully about the nature of the architectural opportunity provided by these buildings and how they might organize the physical and social life of the surrounding city. And so we started to focus on the ceiling basically above the public platform, which would be very prominent as one approached the building from below, since these things were now up above the infrastructure. And it seemed like what was unique here is that there was an opportunity for the ceiling surface to become the kind of register of representational address for these buildings, as opposed to, say, the facade. In a way, the underside of these buildings became the new facade. So we became interested in this idea that the shape of the ceiling might loosely suggest occupancy and kind of organize public activity. So we went through kind of dozens of studies looking at the ceiling, which I won't discuss in detail. We kind of further developed the massing along with the plaza space and parking beneath, kind of a more detailed understanding of how the public access would kind of thread into the existing infrastructure. But these are the parts that I was most interested in. So here's like a worm's eye axon electric looking at the public platform, which now assumes this kind of figural presence from below the highway. And then above that, you can see this ceiling above the public platform. And the ceiling, as we developed it, was designed to actually balance structural requirements and a kind of desire for, thinking back of its empty pavilion, a kind of relaxed geometry that was meant to loosely define zones beneath or to suggest informal occupancies or kind of fuzzy threshold conditions. Meanwhile, there was something going on with this kind of two-color graphic effect of the vaulting that was meant to draw kind of fleeting figures in space as you moved around this thing, gaming with the ceiling's kind of root privilege as the surface of representational address. And so the hope was that this kind of loosely defined spatiality that I hope would be produced by the ceiling, combined with this kind of interrogation of its own configuration, would create a kind of public space of encounter where the different constituencies that are then being brought to the building would kind of mix and mingle in this kind of very vaguely, loosely defined spatiality made by this new more urban canopy. And so here's just a study looking from one of the plazas, and here from the public access again of the highway, and then a study up on the platform looking at the kind of ceiling above. So finally, even in anticipation of the presentation in Dallas, I enrolled a real estate friend to pull together a rough pro forma, which don't look at too long, because admittedly it's full of questionable assumptions. But the bottom line was that it projected revenues just short of $10 million across a 10-year horizon. And our hope, my hope was to go and present in a forum much like this and find this guy and say, look, you got some good ideas, but it didn't happen. What happened was that there were two phases of the competition. There was the open competition, which we were one of 4 winners of, and then there was also an RFP process for which SHOP, OMA, Bofield, and one other, they were the competition winners. Anyway, long story short, this whole thing, much like the Highline competition, was essentially largely a kind of public relations strategy, but they were also hoping to kind of harvest the wealth of ideas across the 8 projects. Backfired on them. OMA proposed flooding the entire site, which was an idea we had too, and then we're like, that's never going to fly. And they did that, it got published in all of the newspapers, and it turned into a big black eye for the entire thing. So we never got it down, and it went no further, and I didn't meet my JR. So I'd like to present one more quick project. I think am I okay, John? Or should I? Yeah, we started a little late. I've never presented this project except on paper, so it'll either be quick or long. But it's another competition entry that we won this time in 2014, where we were finalists in these competitions. It's a competition entry for the 17th annual International Design Competition sponsored by the Mexican architecture journal, Arquine. And this year's, the 2014 competition was asking proposals for the redevelopment of Mexico City's President Benito Juarez International Airport, which is the green figure there on the right, which will soon be decommissioned and replaced by a new airport further to the city's east that's designed by Norman Foster and Fernando Romero. And so amazingly, this is really amazing. This will open up a 746-hectare site very close to Mexico City's historic core. There's the core of the city is the Zocalo. And while this is a dotted line here with nothing over there, actually there's just as much urbanism on the other side of the dotted line. This is the edge of the DF. So it's a huge site in the middle of an immense and dense city. And here again, the kind of gray figure is all of what is called the DF, the federal district in Mexico City, but the broader 20 million person con-urbanization is much, much larger. But again, there is the airport site in green near Zocalo. And the program for the competition was written basically in the hope that the site would largely become a park, or a kind of a site for escape from the surrounding kind of dense urbanity, and some much needed green space for the city's east, which is much, much, much poorer than the west. And so the competition brief that they gave us was that they were going to have 75% park. There would be 15% of, that would be what they're calling the center of the east, which included things like a new kind of transit hub, offices, hotels, stores, and then 10% for residential and the kind of programs that would come along with a kind of residential proposal. So upshot is 25% developed, 75% park. And so when they put this out, I'm sure what they had initially in mind was to have a kind of park in the middle with kind of strategically placed residential and commercial development that would interface with the surrounding neighborhoods around there. And what we initially kind of immediately thought of instead was this image. And this is a map of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec city that became the present Mexico City this is a map that was actually created by the Hernan Cortes expedition in 1524 after the Spanish conquest. And so what we loved about this is that here, Tenochtitlan, the eventual Mexico City, is an urban island. It's kind of an enchanted urban island, which is what it was. Mexico City is a desiccated lake as it is now, and at this time, it was an urban island surrounded by lakes, and kind of objectified by these encompassing lakes. It was kind of offering itself as a sort of object of projective imagination. So apparently, if you wanted to read into this like I want to, Tenochtitlan appeared both exotic and familiar to the invaders. It kind of recalled a European city and its gridiron organization and its civic monuments, formal hierarchies that we can already read into this drawing. Yet it was sufficiently alteric to solicit imagination of kind of alternative social and political practices within it. And remembering that, importantly, Cortez's drawing appeared just 5 years after images like this began to appear. So this is an image of Thomas More's Utopia from 1516, also an island, also 5 cities on this island, but in the New World. We can see, looking back to this image, that Mexico City was starting to insert itself within this kind of discourse of the urban utopia within Renaissance Europe, essentially. And in fact, this image went to Europe and was used by people like Albert Dürer to create kind of utopian drawings of urbanism within the 15th and 16th centuries. So the upshot here is the important thing is that Tenochtitlan was kind of deeply enrolled in these kinds of ideas of the utopic imaginary. It's the legacy of Mexico City. But today, Mexico City is a city of enclaves. It's created from colonias, which are kinds of neighborhoods that were constructed by individual developers in the 19th century. It also has gated communities, the kinds of enclaves that we think of. Other kinds of barrios. The city itself, I would say, more than most cities I've ever looked at, is really a patchwork of discrete enclaves that are stamped out in kind of formal organizations throughout the city, which is what this diagram is trying to show. And, importantly, as in most of the world, these enclaves index kind of intense social and political exclusion. That is extant throughout the city. But despite that, the project we ended up doing was interested in thinking about kind of the relationship between the enclave and utopia. Was interested in finding in the enclave a kind of fleeting glimpse of Mexico City's history of utopic projection. So we thought, maybe like the storied island of Tenochtitlan, this kind of formal separation of the urban enclave from its surrounding prompts speculative projection about what might happen in its interior. And certainly, very much like Thomas More's Utopia, the exceptionalism of urban enclaves often sponsors these kinds of alternative social and political structures. Again, think of gated communities. So the project here was interested in recuperating Mexico City's kind of utopic capacity through the design of a new enclave on the site of the Benito Juarez International Airport. We eventually ended up consolidating. There was supposed to be another diagram in here, but we took the 25% of development, and rather than kind of putting it around the perimeter, we consolidated it into this kind of gridiron that you're seeing at the middle of the block figure. And here in the gridiron, the block structure is an approximation of the size of the Zocalo, the historic center, which is number 1 on this map. And then kind of crossing this were extensions of imperial roads and also an extension of the existing transit system, starting to try to irrigate the site with constituencies from across the city. And then around the kind of new floating enclave, the ground was designed as parks. It was, I don't know if you can see the kind of topography from there, but we manipulated the topography so that it would hopefully begin to accept the groundwater, the gray water from the surrounding communities, and these things were designed as kind of bioswales. And then the parks themselves the series of parks themselves were designed with paths that would interface into the surrounding communities, many of which are enclaves in and of themselves. And here the idea was that one could walk through the park and see the enclave within, but never actually get there through there. So it had this kind of distancing effect where it was always the storied place over there that one can never get to. Then, as I said, the parks were kind of reshaped to create bioswales, which I think become a little bit more evident here. And then the blocks were filled with building types that were characteristic of kind of varied and discrete enclaves throughout Mexico City that were then placed in kind of novel spatial adjacency. So we kind of looked at the pieces themselves and tried to understand how these types that really indexed radically different social constituencies throughout the city might create new kinds of increments of block. And then also inserted in here, I'll show these mostly in renderings, but there are 4 pieces where you see the green rectangles that I call new ruins, which had something to do, some kind of analogous relationship to the status of ruin in Mexico City and the ability of broad bandwidths of the public to kind of read into the history of the Aztec city through the ruin. So here are the types that were sampled, which run from kind of social housing to what number 9 is, which is really high-end new housing towers that are happening in the Santa Fe district of the city. And these numbers on here correspond to the numbers essentially on the map. So again, these are like housing types, building types, indexing different constituencies from different enclaves throughout the city, recombined. And here is kind of the overall view of what the enclave would be with these pieces, again, that we were calling the new ruins distributed between. They would also become kind of transit hubs. The idea was that the transit would go underground right down the middle of the new enclave. These things would become hubs. The new ruins themselves were kind of depressed within another set of bioswales, and then beneath that was an idea of transit being done. And we were interested, in that kind of, the idea of a kind of surrealist space that might emerge from the recombination of these types, and what that kind of aesthetic, this kind of hauntingly familiar aesthetic or strange juxtaposition of familiar buildings might do, again, towards this goal of recombining the diverse constituencies within the enclave. Or weird things like the new ruin kind of staring at you from over some of the buildings. And again, these things were meant to be kind of depressed within bioswales. And we had ideas about these also kind of servicing. This is one of those things we're calling new ruins, which partially office, partially civic functions, and then also an idea of harvesting rain and kind of servicing some of the surrounding communities with water. And you can also see here an idea about how the transit might kind of seep in here. And here a view, again, of seeing the city, this kind of new enclave from without. So this, one of these trails that would come from the neighborhoods, but you could never actually reach the enclave. So trying to leverage the idea that it was a kind of city just beyond reach. And I think the city beyond reach is a good place to stop collection.